Metamorphoses by Publius Ovidius Naso, translated by Brooks Moore. Book 1, Part 1. My soul is wrought to sing of forms transformed to bodies new and strange. Immortal gods, inspire my heart, for ye have changed yourselves, and all things you have changed. O lead my song in smooth and measured strains, from olden days when earth began to this completed time. Before the ocean and the earth appeared, before the skies had overspread them all, the face of nature in a vast expanse was naught but chaos uniformly waste. It was a rude and undeveloped mass that nothing made except a ponderous weight, and all discordant elements confused were there congested in a shapeless heap. As yet the sun afforded earth no light, nor did the moon renew her crescent horns. The earth was not suspended in the air, exactly balanced by her heavy weight. Not far along the margin of the shores had Amphitrite stretched her lengthened arms, for all the land was mixed with sea and air. The land was soft, the sea unfit to sail, the atmosphere opaque, to naught was given a proper form, and everything was strife, and all was mingled in a seething mass, with hot the cold parts strove, and wet with dry, and soft with hard, and weight with empty void. But God, or kindly nature, ended strife. He cut the land from skies, the sea from land, the heavens ethereal from material air. And when were all evolved from that dark mass, he bound the fractious parts in tranquil peace. The fiery element of convex heaven leaped from the mass devoid of dragging weight, and chose the summit arch, to which the air as next in quality was next in place. The earth, more dense, attracted grosser parts, and moved by gravity sank underneath, and last of all the wide surrounding waves in deeper channels rolled around the globe. And when this God, which one is yet unknown, had carved asunder that discordant mass, had thus reduced it to its elements, that every part should equally combine, when time began he rounded out the earth, and moulded it to form a mighty globe. Then poured he forth the deeps and gave command that they should billow in the rapid winds, that they should compass every shore of earth. He also added fountains, pools, and lakes, and bound with shelving banks the slanting streams, which partly are absorbed and partly join the boundless ocean. Thus received amid the wide expanse of uncontrolled waves, they beat the shores instead of crooked banks. At his command the boundless plains extend, the valleys are depressed, the woods are clothed in green, the stony mountains rise. And as the heavens are intersected on the right by two broad zones, by two that cut the left, and by a fifth consumed with ardent heat, with such a number did the careful God mark off the compassed weight, and thus the earth received as many climes. Such heat consumes the middle zone, that none may dwell therein, and two extremes are covered with deep snow, and two are placed betwixt, the hot and cold, which mixed together give a temperate clime. And over all the atmosphere suspends with weight proportioned to the fiery sky, exactly as the weight of earth compares with weight of water. And he ordered mist to gather in the air, and spread the clouds. He fixed the thunders that disturb our souls, and brought the lightning on destructive winds that also waft the cold. Nor did the great Artificer permit these mighty winds to blow unbounded in the pathless skies, but each discordant brother fixed in space, although his power can scarce restrain the rage to rend the universe. At his command to far Aurora Eros took his way, to Naboth Persia, and that mountain range first gilded by the dawn, and Zephyr's flight was towards the evening star and peaceful shores, warm with the setting sun. And Boreas invaded Scythia and the northern snows, and Auster wafted to the distant south, where clouds and rain encompass his abode. And over these he fixed the liquid sky, devoid of weight and free from earthly dross. And scarcely had he separated these, and fixed their certain bounds, when all the stars, which long were pressed and hidden in the mass, began to gleam out from the plains of heaven, and traversed with the gods bright ether fields, and lest some part might be bereft of life, the gleaming waves were filled with twinkling fish, the earth was covered with wild animals, the agitated air was filled with birds. But one more perfect and more sanctified, a being capable of lofty thought, intelligent to rule, was wanting still. Man was created. Did the unknown God, designing then a better world, make man of seed divine? Or did Prometheus take the new soil of earth, that still contained some godly element of heaven's life, and use it to create the race of men, first mingling it with water of new streams, so that his new creation, upright men, was made in image of commanding gods? On earth the brute creation bends its gaze, but man was given a lofty countenance, and was commanded to behold the skies, and with an upright face may view the stars. And so it was that shapeless clay put on the form of man till then unknown to earth. First was the golden age, then rectitude spontaneous in the heart prevailed, and faith. Avengers were not seen, for laws unframed were all unknown and needless. Punishment and fear of penalties existed not. No harsh decrees were fixed on brazen plates. No suppliant multitude the countenance of justice feared, averting, for they dwelt without a judge in peace. Descended not the steeps, shorn from its height, the lofty pine, cleaving the trackless ways of alien shores, nor distant realms were known to wandering men. The towns were not entrenched for time of war, they had no brazen trumpets, straight, nor horns of curving brass, nor helmets, shields, nor swords. There was no thought of martial pomp, secure a happy multitude enjoyed repose. Then of her own accord the earth produced a store of every fruit. The harrow touched her not, nor did the plowshare wound her fields. And men, content with given food, and none compelling, gathered arbute fruits and wild strawberries on the mountain sides, and ripe blackberries clinging to the bush, and corners and sweet acorns on the ground, down fallen from the spreading tree of Jove. Eternal spring, soft-breathing zephyrs soothed and warmly cherished buds and blooms, produced without a seed. The valleys, though unplowed, gave many fruits. The fields, though not renewed, white glistened with the heavy bearded wheat. Rivers flowed milk and nectar, and the trees, the very oak trees, then gave honey of themselves. When Saturn had been banished into night, and all the world was ruled by Jove supreme, the silver age, though not so good as gold, but still surpassing yellow brass, prevailed. Jove first reduced to years the primal spring, by him divided into periods four, unequal, summer, autumn, winter, spring. Then glowed with tawny heat the parched air, or pendant icicles in winter froze, and man stopped crouching in crude caverns, while he built his homes of tree-rods, bark entwined. Then were the cereals planted in long rows, and bullocks groaned beneath the heavy yoke. The third age followed, called the Age of Bronze, when cruel people were inclined to arms, but not to impious crimes, and last of all the ruthless and hard age of iron prevailed, from which malignant vein great evil sprung, and modesty and faith and truth took flight, and in their stead deceits and snares and frauds and violence, and wicked love of gain succeeded. Then the sailor spread his sails to winds unknown, and keels that long had stood on lofty mountains pierced uncharted waves. Surveyors anxious marked with metes and bounds the lands created free as light and air. Nor need the rich ground furnish only crops, and give due nourishment by right required. They penetrated to the bowels of earth, and dug up wealth, bad cause of all our ills. Rich ores which long ago the earth had hid, and deep removed to gloomy Stygian caves. And soon destructive iron and harmful gold were brought to light. And war, which uses both, came forth, and shook with sanguinary grip his clashing arms. Rapacity broke forth. The guest was not protected from his host, the father-in-law from his own son-in-law. Even brothers seldom could abide in peace. The husband threatened to destroy his wife, and she her husband. Horrid step-dames mixed the deadly henbane. Eager sons inquired their fathers' ages. Piety was slain, and last of all the virgin deity Astrea vanished from the blood-stained earth. And lest ethereal heights should long remain less troubled than the earth, the throne of heaven was threatened by the giants, and they piled mountain on mountain to the lofty stars. But Jove, omnipotent, shot thunderbolts through Mount Olympus, and he overturned from Ossa huge, enormous Pelion. And while these dreadful bodies lay overwhelmed in their tremendous bulk, so fame reports, the earth was reeking with the copious blood of her gigantic sons. And thus, replete with moisture, she infused the steaming gore with life renewed. So that a monument of such ferocious stock should be retained, she made that offspring in the shape of men. But this new race alike despised the gods, and by the greed of savage slaughter proved the sanguinary birth. When, from his throne supreme, the son of Saturn viewed their deeds, he deeply groaned, and calling to his mind the loathsome feast Lycaon had prepared, a recent deed not common to report, his soul conceived great anger, worthy Jove, and he convened a council. No delay detained the chosen gods. When skies are clear, a path is well defined on high, which men, because so wide, have named the Milky Way. It makes a passage for the deities, and leads to mentions of the thunder god, to Jove's imperial home. On either side of its wide way the noble gods are seen. Inferior gods in other parts abide, but there the potent and renowned of heaven have fixed their homes. It is a glorious place. Our most audacious verse might designate the palace of high heaven. When the gods were seated, therefore, in its marble halls, the king of all above the throne sat high, and leaning on his ivory sceptre, thrice and once again he shook his awful locks, wherewith he moved the earth and seas and stars, and thus indignantly began to speak. The time when serpent-footed giants strove to fix their 100 arms on captive heaven, not more than this event could cause alarm for my dominion of the universe. Although it was a savage enemy, yet warred we with a single source derived of one. Now must I utterly destroy this mortal race, wherever Nereus roars around the world. Yea, by the infernal streams that glide through Stygian groves beneath the world, I swear it. Every method has been tried. The knife must cut immedicable wounds, lest maladies infect untainted parts. Beneath my sway are demi-gods and fauns, nymphs, rustic deities, sylvans of the hills, satyrs. All these, unworthy heaven's abodes, we should at least permit to dwell on earth, which we to them bequeathed. What think ye, gods? Is safety theirs when I, your sovereign lord, the thunderbolt controller, am ensnared by fierce Lycaon? Ardent in their wrath, the astonished gods demand revenge overtake this miscreant, he who dared commit such crimes. 'Twas even thus, when raged that impious band to blot the Roman name in sacred blood of Caesar, sudden apprehensive fears of ruin absolute astonished men, and all the world convulsed. Nor is the love thy people bear to thee, Augustus, less than these displayed to Jupiter, whose voice and gesture all the murmuring host restrained. And as indignant clamour ceased, suppressed by regnant majesty, Jove once again broke the deep silence with imperial words. Dismiss your cares, he paid the penalty. However, all the crime and punishment now learn from this. An infamous report of this unholy age had reached my ears, and wishing it were false I sloped my course from high Olympus, and although a god, disguised in human form I view the world. It would delay us to recount the crimes unnumbered, for reports were less than truth. I traversed Menelaus, where fearful dens abound, over Lycaeus, wintry slopes of pine-tree groves, across Cylleni's steep, and as the twilight warned of night's approach, I stopped in that Arcadian tyrant's realms, and entered his inhospitable home. And when I showed his people that a god had come, the lowly prayed and worshipped me, but this Lycaon mocked their pious vows, and scoffing said, "A fair experiment will prove the truth, if this be god or man." And he prepared to slay me in the night, to end my slumbers in the sleep of death. So made he merry with his impious proof, but not content with this, he cut the throat of a Molossian hostage sent to him, and partly softened his still quivering limbs in boiling water, partly roasted them on fires that burned beneath. And when this flesh was served to me on tables, I destroyed his dwelling and his worthless household gods with thunderbolts avenging. Terror-struck, he took to flight, and on the silent plains is howling in his vain attempts to speak. He raves and rages, and his greedy jaws, desiring their accustomed slaughter, turn against the sheep, still eager for their blood. His vesture separates in shaggy hair, his arms are chained to legs, and as a wolf he has the same grey locks, the same hard face, the same bright eyes, the same ferocious look. Thus fell one house, but not one house alone deserved to perish. Over all the earth ferocious deeds prevail. All men conspire in evil. Let them therefore feel the weight of dreadful penalty so justly earned, for such hath my unchanging will ordained. With exclamations some approved the words of Jove, and added fuel to his wrath, while others gave assent. But all deplored and questioned the estate of earth deprived of mortals. Who could offer frankincense upon the altars? Would he suffer earth to be despoiled by hungry beasts of prey? Such idle questions of the state of men the king of gods forbade, but granted soon to people earth with race miraculous, unlike the first. End of Book 1, Part 1.
Book 1, Part 2 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Metamorphoses by Publius Ovidius Naso. Translated by Brooks Moore. Book 1, Part 2. And now his thunderbolts would Jove wide scatter, but he feared the flames, unnumbered sacred ether might ignite and burn the axle of the universe. And he remembered, in the scroll of fate, there is a time appointed when the earth and sea and heavens shall melt, and fire destroy the universe of mighty labor wrought. Such weapons by the skill of Cyclops forged, for different punishment he laid aside, for straightway he preferred to overwhelm the mortal race beneath deep waves and storms from ever-raining sky. And instantly he shut the north wind in Aeolian caves, and every other wind that might dispel the gathering clouds. He bade the south wind blow. The south wind flies abroad with dripping wings, concealing in the gloom his awful face. The drenching rains descends from his wet beard and hoary locks. Dark clouds are on his brows, and from his wings and garments drip the dews. His great hands press the overhanging clouds. Loudly the thunders roll, the torrents pour. Iris, the messenger of Juno, clad in many-colored raiment, upward draws the streaming moisture to renew the clouds. The standing grain is beaten to the ground, the rustic's crops are scattered in the mire, and he bewails the long year's fruitless toil. The wrath of Jove was not content with powers that emanate from heaven. He brought to aid his azure brother, lord of flowing waves, who called upon the rivers and the streams. And when they entered his impearled abode, Neptune, their ancient ruler, thus began: "A long appeal is needless. Pour ye forth in rage of power. Open up your fountains. Rush over obstacles. Let every stream pour forth in boundless floods." Thus he commands, and none dissenting, all the river gods return, and opening up their fountains, roll tumultuous to the deep, unfruitful sea. And Neptune with his trident smote the earth, which trembling with unwonted throes heaved up the sources of her waters bare, and through her open plains the rapid rivers rushed resistless, onward bearing the waving grain, the budding groves, the houses, sheep and men, and holy temples and their sacred urns. The mansions that remained, resisting vast and total ruin, deepening waves concealed and whelmed their tottering turrets in the flood and roiling gulf. And now one vast expanse, the land and sea were mingled in the waste of endless waves, a sea without a shore. One desperate man seized on the nearest hill. Another, sitting in his curved boat, plied the long oar where he was wont to plough. Another sailed above his grain, above his hidden dwelling, and another hooked a fish that sported in a leafy elm. Perchance an anchor dropped in verdant fields, or curving keels were pushed through tangled vines, and where the gracile goat enjoyed the green, unsightly seals reposed. Beneath the waves were wandering Nereids, viewing cities, groves, and houses. Dolphins darting amid the trees, meshed in the twisted branches, beat against the shaken oak trees. There the sheep, afraid, swim with the frightened wolf. The surging waves float tigers and lions. Availeth not his lightning shock the wild boar, nor avails the stag's fleet-footed speed. The wandering bird, seeking unambrageous groves and hidden vales, with wearied pinion droops into the sea. The waves increasing surge above the hills, and rising waters dash on mountain tops. Myriads by the waves are swept away, and those the waters spare, for lack of food, starvation slowly overcomes at last. A fruitful land and fair, but now submerged beneath a wilderness of rising waves. Twixt Oeta and Ionia and Phocis lies, where through the clouds Parnassus summits twain point upwards to the stars, unmeasured height, save which the rolling billows covered all. There in a small and fragile boat arrived Deucalion and the consort of his couch, prepared to worship the Corycian nymphs, the mountain deities, and Themis kind, who in that age revealed in oracles the voice of fate. And as he, no other lived so good and just, as she, no other feared the gods. When Jupiter beheld the globe in ruin covered, swept with wasting waves, and when he saw one man of myriads left, one helpless woman left of myriads lone, both innocent and worshipping the gods, he scattered all the clouds. He blew away the great storms by the cold north wind. Once more the earth appeared to heaven, and the skies appeared to earth. The fury of the main abated, for the ocean ruler laid his trident down, and he pacified the waters, and called on azure Triton. Triton rose above the waving seas, his shoulders mailed in purple shells. He bade the Triton blow in his sounding shell, the wandering streams and rivers to recall with signal known. A hollow wreath trumpet, tapering wide and slender stemmed, the Triton took amain, and wound the pearly shell at midmost sea. Betwixt the rising and the setting suns, the wildered notes resounded shore to shore, and as it touched his lips, wet with the brine beneath his dripping beard, sounded retreat, and all the waters of the land and sea obeyed. Their fountains heard, and ceased to flow. Their waters subsided. Hidden hills uprose, emerged the shores of ocean. Channels filled with flowing streams. The soil appeared. The land increased its surface as the waves decreased. And after length of days the trees put forth, with ooze on bending boughs, their naked tops. And all the wasted globe was now restored. But as he viewed the vast and silent world, Deucalion wept, and thus to Pyrrha spoke. O sister, wife, alone of women left, my kindred in descent and origin, dearest companion of my marriage bed, doubly endeared by deepening dangers born, of all the dawn and eve behold of earth, but you and I are left, for the deep sea has kept the rest. And what prevents the tide from overwhelming us? Remaining clouds affright us. How could you endure your fears if you alone were rescued by this fate, and who would then console your bitter grief? Oh, be assured, if you were buried in the waves, that I would follow you and be with you. Oh, would that by my father's art I might restore the people, and inspire this clay to take the form of man. Alas, the gods decreed, and only we are living. Thus Deucalion's plaint to Pyrrha. And they wept. And after he had spoken, they resolved to ask the aid of sacred oracles. And so they hastened to Cephisian waves, which rolled a turbid flood to channels known. Thence, when their robes and brows were sprinkled well, they turned their footsteps to the goddess's fane. Its gables were befouled with reeking moss, and on its altars every fire was cold. But when the twain had reached the temple steps, they fell upon the earth, inspired with awe, and kissed the cold stone with their trembling lips, and said, If righteous prayers appease the gods, and if the wrath of high celestial powers may thus be turned, declare, O Themis, whence and what the art may raise humanity. O gentle goddess, help the dying world. Moved by their supplications, she replied, Depart from me, and veil your brows. Ungird your robes, and cast behind you, as you go, the bones of your great mother. Long they stood in dumb amazement. Pyrrha, first of voice, refused the mandate, and with trembling lips implored the goddess to forgive. She feared to violate her mother's bones, and vex her sacred spirit. Often pondered they the words involved in such obscurity, repeating oft, and thus Deucalion to Epimetheus' daughter uttered speech of soothing import. Oracles are just, and urge not evil deeds, or naught avails the skill of thought. Our mother is the earth, and I may judge the stones of earth are bones that we should cast behind us as we go. And although Pyrrha by his words was moved, she hesitated to comply. Both amazed doubted the purpose of the oracle, but deemed no harm to come of trial. They, descending from the temple, veiled their heads, and loosed their robes, threw some stones behind them. It was much beyond belief. Were not receding ages witness, hard and rigid stones assumed a softer form, enlarging as their brittle nature changed to milder substance, till the shape of man appeared, imperfect and faintly outlined at first, as marble statue chiseled in the rough. The soft, moist parts were changed to softer flesh, the hard and brittle substance into bones. The veins retained their ancient name. And now the gods supreme ordained that every stone Deucalion threw should take the form of man, and those by Pyrrha cast should woman's form assume. And so we are hardy to endure and prove by toil and deeds from what we sprung. And after this the earth spontaneous produced the world of animals, when all remaining moistures of miry fens fermented in the sun, and fruitful seeds in soils nutritious grew to shapes ordained. So, when the seventh-streamed Nile from oozy fields returneth duly to her ancient bed, the sun's ethereal rays impregnate the slime, that, happily, as the peasants turn the soil, they find strange animals, unknown before, some in the moment of their birth, and some deprived of limbs, imperfect, often part alive, and part of slime inanimate, are fashioned in one body. Heat combined with moisture so conceives, and life results from those two things. For though the flames may be the foes of water, everything that lives begins in humid vapor, and it seems discordant concord is the means of life. When earth, spread over with diluvian ooze, felt heat ethereal from the glowing sun, unnumbered species to the light she gave, and gave to being many an ancient form, or monster new created. Unwilling she created thus enormous Python, thou unheard of serpent spread so far athwart the side of a vast mountain, didst fill with fear the race of new created man. The god that bears the bow, a weapon used till then only to hunt the deer and agile goat, destroyed the monster with a myriad darts, and almost emptied all his quiver, till envenomed gore oozed forth from livid wounds. Lest, in a dark oblivion time should hide the fame of this achievement, sacred sports are instituted from the Python, called the Pythian Games. In these the happy youth, who proved victorious in the chariot race, running, and boxing, with an honored crown of oak leaves was enwreathed. The laurel then was not created, wherefore Phoebus, bright and godlike, beauteous with his flowing hair, was wont to wreathe his brows with various leaves. Daphne, the daughter of a river god, was first beloved by Phoebus, the great god of glorious light. 'Twas not a cause of chance, but out of Cupid's vengeful spite, that she was fated to torment the Lord of Light. For Phoebus, proud of Python's death, beheld that impish god of love upon a time when he was bending his diminished bow, and voicing his contempt and anger said, "What, wanton boy, are mighty arms to thee great weapons suited to the needs of war? The bow is only for the use of those large deities of heaven, whose strength may deal wounds mortal to the savage beasts of prey, and who, courageous, overcome their foes. It is a proper weapon to the use of such as slew with arrows Python, huge, whose pestilential carcass vast extend covered. Content thee with the flames thy torch enkindles, fires too subtle for my thought, and leave to me the glory that is mine." To him, undaunted, Venus' son replied, "O Phoebus, thou canst conquer all the world with thy strong bow and arrows, but with this small arrow I shall pierce thy vaunting breast. And by the measure that thy might exceeds the broken powers of thy defeated foes, so is thy glory less than mine." No more he said, but with his wings expanded, thence flew lightly to Parnassus' lofty peak. There from his quiver he plucked arrows twain, most curiously wrought of different art, one love exciting, one repelling love. The dart of love was glittering, gold, and sharp, the other had a blunted tip of lead, and with that dull lead dart he shot the nymph, but with the keen point of the golden dart he pierced the bone and marrow of the god. Immediately the one with love was filled, the other, scouting at the thought of love, rejoiced in the deep shadow of the woods, and as the virgin Phoebe, who denies the joys of love, and loves the joys of chase, a maiden's fillet bound her flowing hair, and her pure mind denied the love of man. Beloved and wooed, she wandered secret paths, for never could her modesty endure the glance of man, or listen to his love. Her grieving father spoke to her, "Alas, my daughter, I have wished a son-in-law, and now you owe a grandchild to the joy of my old age." But Daphne only hung her head to hide her shame. The nuptial torch seemed criminal to her. She even clung, caressing, with her arms round his neck, and pled, "My dearest father, let me live a virgin always, for remember Jove did grant it to Diana at her birth." But though her father promised her desire, her loveliness prevailed against their will, for Phoebus, when he saw her, waxed distraught, and filled with wonder his sick fancy raised delusive hopes, and his own oracles deceived him. As the stubble in the fields flared up, or as the stacked wheat is consumed by flames, enkindled from a spark or torch the chance pedestrian may neglect at dawn, so was the bosom of the god consumed, and so desire flamed in his stricken heart. he saw her bright hair waving on her neck. How beautiful if properly arranged! He saw her eyes like stars of sprinkling fire, her lips for kissing sweetest, in her hands and fingers, and her arms, her shoulders white as ivory. And whatever was not seen, more beautiful must be. Swift as the wind from his pursuing feet, the virgin fled, and neither stopped nor heeded as he called, O nymph, O Daphne, I entreat thee stay. It is no enemy that follows thee. Why, so the lamb leaps from the raging wolf, and from the lion runs the timid fawn, and from the eagle flies the trembling dove. All hasten from their natural enemy, but I alone pursue for my dear love. Alas, if thou shouldest fall and mar thy face, or tear upon the bramble thy soft thighs, or should I prove unwilling cause of pain? The wilderness is rough and dangerous, and I beseech thee be more careful. I will follow slowly. Ask of whom thou wilt, and thou shalt learn that I am not a churl. I am no mountain dweller of rude caves, nor clown compelled to watch the sheep and goats. And neither canst thou know from whom thy feet fly fearful, or thou wouldest not leave me thus. The Delphic land, the Petarian realm, Claros and Tenedos revere my name, and my immortal sire is Jupiter. The present, past, and future are through me in sacred groves revealed to man, and from my harp the harmonies of sound are borrowed by their bards to praise the gods. My bow is certain, but a flaming shaft surpassing mine has pierced my heart, untouched before. The art of medicine is my invention, and the power of herbs. But though the world declare my useful works, there was no herb to medicate my wound, and all the arts that save have failed their Lord. But even as he made his plaint, the nymph, with timid footsteps, fled from his approach, and left him to his murmurs and his pain. Lovely the virgin seemed as the soft wind exposed her limbs, and as the zephyrs fond fluttered amid her garments, and the breeze fanned lightly in her flowing hair. She seemed most lovely to his fancy in her flight, and mad with love he followed in her steps, and silent hastened his increasing speed. As when the greyhound sees the frightened hare flit over the plain, with eager nose outstretched, impetuous, he rushes on his prey, and gains upon her till he treads her feet, and almost fastens in her side his fangs. But she, whilst dreading that her end is near, is suddenly delivered from her fright. And so it was with the god and virgin. One with hope pursued, the other fled in fear, and he who followed, borne on wings of love, permitted her no rest, and gained on her, till his warm breath mingled in her hair. Her strength spent, pale and faint, with pleading eyes she gazed upon her father's waves, and prayed, Help me, my father, if thy flowing streams have virtue. Cover me, O Mother Earth, destroy the beauty that has injured me, or change the body that destroys my life. Before her prayer was ended, torpor seized on all her body, and a thin bark closed around her gentle bosom, and her hair became as moving leaves. Her arms were changed to waving branches, and her active feet as clinging roots were fastened to the ground. Her face was hidden with encircling leaves. Phoebus admired and loved the graceful tree, for still, though changed, her slender form remained, and with his right hand lingering on the trunk, he felt her bosom throbbing in the bark. He clung to the trunk and branch as though to twine his form with hers, and fondly kissed the wood that shrank from every kiss. And thus the god, Although thou canst not be my bride, thou shalt be called my chosen tree, and by green leaves, O laurel, shall forever crown my brows, be wreathed around my quiver and my lyre. The Roman heroes shall be crowned with thee, as long processions climb the Capitol, and chanting throngs proclaim their victories. And as a faithful warden, thou shalt guard the civic crown of oak leaves fixed between thy branches, and before Augustan gates. And as my youthful head is never shorn, so also shalt thou ever bear thy leaves unchanging to thy glory. Here the god, Phoebus Apollo, ended his lament, and unto him the laurel bent her boughs, and so lately fashioned, and it seemed to him Her graceful nod gave answer to his love. End of Book 1, Part 2. Book 1, Part 3 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Metamorphoses by Publius Ovidius Naso. Translated by Brooks Moore. Book 1, Part 3. There is a grove in Thessaly, enclosed on every side with crags, precipitous, on which a forest grows, and this is called the Vale of Tempe. Through this valley flows the river Peneus, white with foaming waves that issue from the foot of Pindus, whence with sudden fall up gather steamy clouds that sprinkle mist upon the circling trees, and far away with mighty roar resound. It is the abode, the solitary home, that mighty river loves, where deep in gloom of rocky cavern he resides and rules the flowing waters and the water nymphs abiding there. All the rivers of that land now hasten thither, doubtful to console or flatter Daphne's parent, poplar-crowned Sperichios, swift Enipeus, and wild Amphiros, old Epidanos and Ios, with all their kindred streams, that wandering maze and wearied seek the ocean. Inachus alone is absent, hidden in his cave obscure, deepening his waters with his tears, most wretchedly bewailing, for he deems his daughter Io lost. If she may live or roam a spirit in the nether shades, he dares not even guess, but dreads. For Jove not long before had seen her while returning from her father's stream, and said, O virgin, worthy of immortal Jove, although some happy mortal's chosen bride, behold these shades of overhanging trees, and seek their cool recesses, while the sun is glowing in the height of the middle skies. And as he spoke, he pointed out the groves. But should the dens of wild beasts frighten you, with safety you may enter the deep woods, conducted by a god, and not with a god of small repute, but in the care of him who holds the heavenly scepter in his hands and fulminates the trackless thunderbolts. Forsake me not. For while he spoke, she fled, and swiftly left behind the pasture fields of Lerna, and Lyrcia's arbours, where the trees are planted thickly. But the god called forth a heavy shadow, which involved the wide extended earth, and stopped her flight, and ravished in that cloud her chastity. Meanwhile the goddess Juno, gazing down on the earth's expanse, with wonder saw the clouds as dark as night enfold those middle fields, while day was bright above. She was convinced the clouds were none composed of river mist, nor raised from marshy fens. Suspicious now, from oft-detected amours of her spouse, she glanced around to find her absent lord, and quite convinced that he was far from heaven, she thus exclaimed, This cloud deceives my mind, or Jove has wronged me. From the dome of heaven she glided down, and stood upon the earth, and bade the clouds recede. But Jove had known the coming of his queen. He had transformed the lovely Io, so that she appeared a milk-white heifer, formed so beautiful and fair that envious Juno gazed on her. She queried, Whose? What herd? What pasture fields? As if she guessed no knowledge of the truth. And Jupiter, falsely hearted, said the cow was earth-begotten, for he feared his queen might make inquiry of the owner's name. Juno implored the heifer as a gift. What then was left the father of the gods? 'Twould be a cruel thing to sacrifice his cow beloved to a rival's wrath. Although refusal must imply his guilt, the shame and the love of her almost prevailed. But if a present of such little worth were now denied the sharer of his couch, the partner of his birth, 'twould prove indeed the earth-born heifer other than she seemed, and so he gave his mistress up to her. Juno, regardful of Jove's cunning art, lest he might change her to her human form, gave the unhappy heifer to the charge of Argus, Aristoides, whose head was circled with 100 glowing eyes, of which but 2 did slumber in their turn, whilst all the others kept on watch and guard. Whichever way he stood, his gaze was fixed on Io. Even if he turned away, his watchful eyes on Io still remained. He let her feed by day, but when the sun was under the deep world, he shut her up, and tied a rope around her tender neck. She fed upon green leaves and bitter herbs, and on the cold ground slept, too often bare, and she could not rest upon a cushioned couch. She drank the troubled waters. Hoping aid, she tried to stretch her imploring arms to Argus, but all in vain, for now no arms remained. The sound of bellowing was all she heard, and she was frightened with her proper voice. Where former days she loved to roam and sport, she wandered by the banks of Inachus. There, imaged in the stream, she saw her horns, and startled, turned and fled. And Inachus and her sister Naiads knew her not. Although she followed them, they knew her not, although she suffered them to touch her sides and praise her. When the ancient Inachus gathered sweet herbs and offered them to her, she licked his hands, kissing her father's palms, nor could she more restrain her falling tears. As if words as well as tears would flow, she might implore his aid, and tell her name and all her sad misfortune. But instead she traced in dust the letters of her name with cloven hoof, and thus her sad estate was known. "Ah, wretched me!" her father cried, and as he clung around her horns and neck, repeated while she groaned, "Ah, wretched me! Art thou my daughter, sought in every clime? When lost, I could not grieve for thee as now that thou art found. Thy sighs, instead of words, heave up from thy deep breast. Thy longings give me answer. I prepared the nuptial torch and bridal chamber, in my ignorance, since my first hope was for a son-in-law, and then I dreamed of children from the match. But now the herd may furnish thee a mate, and all thy issue of the herd must be. Oh, that a righteous death may end my grief! It is a dreadful thing to be a god. Behold, the lethal gate of death is shut against me, and my growing grief must last throughout eternity." While thus he moaned, came starry Argus there, and Io bore from her lamenting father. Thence he led his charge to other pastures, and removed from her, upon a lofty mountain sat, whence he could always watch her undisturbed. The sovereign god no longer could endure to witness Io's woes. He called his son, whom Maia, brightest of the Pleiades, brought forth, and bade him slay the star-eyed guard Argus. He seized his sleep compelling wand, and fastened waving wings upon his swift feet, and deftly fixed his brimmed hat on his head. Lo, Mercury, the favoured son of Jove, descending to the earth from heaven's plains, put off his cap and wings, though he still retained his wand, with which he drove through pathless wilds some stray she-goats, and as a shepherd fared, piping on oaken reeds melodious tunes. Argus, delighted with the charming sound of this new art, began, "Whoever thou art, sit with me on this slope, beneath the trees in cooling shade, whilst browse the tended flock abundant herbs, for thou canst see the shade is fit for shepherds." Wherefore Mercury sat down beside the keeper, and conversed of various things, passing the laggard hours. Then soothly piped he on the joined reeds, to lull those ever watchful eyes asleep. But Argus strove his languor to subdue, and though some drowsy eyes might slumber, still were some that vigil kept. Again he spoke, for the pipes were yet a recent art. "I pray thee, tell me what chance discovered these." To him the god, "A famous Naiad dwelt among the Hamadryads, on the cold Arcadian summit Nonacris, whose name was Syrinx. Often she escaped the gods, that wandered in the groves of sylvan shades, and often fled from satyrs that pursued. Vowing virginity in all pursuits, she strove to emulate Diana's ways, and as that graceful goddess wears her robe, so Syrinx girded hers, that one might well believe Diana there. Even though her bow were made of horn, Diana's wrought of gold, yet she may well deceive. Now chanced it Pan, whose head was girt with prickly pines, espied the nymph returning from the Lycian hill, and these words uttered he: But Mercury refrained from further speech, and Pan's appeals remained untold. If he had told it all, the tale of Syrinx would have followed thus. But she despised the prayers of Pan, and fled through the pathless wilds, until she had arrived the placid Ladon's sandy stream, whose waves prevented her escape. There she implored her sister nymphs to change her form, and Pan, believing he had caught her, held instead some marshy reeds for the body of the nymph. And while he sighed, the moving winds began to utter plaintive music in the reeds, so sweet and voice-like that poor Pan exclaimed, "Forever this discovery shall remain a sweet communion binding thee to me." And this explains why reeds of different length, when joined together by cementing wax, derived the name of Syrinx from the maid. Such words the bright god Mercury would say, but now, perceiving Argus's eyes were dimmed in languorous doze, he hushed his voice and touched the drooping eyelids with his magic wand, compelling slumber. Then, without delay, he struck the sleeper with his crescent sword, where neck and head unite, and hurled his head, blood dripping, down the rocks and rugged cliff. Low lies Argus. Dark is the light of all his 100 eyes, his many orbed lights extinguished in the universal gloom that night surrounds. But Saturn's daughters spread their glister on the feathers of her bird, emblazoned its tail with starry gems. Juno made haste, inflamed with towering rage, to vent her wrath on Io, and she raised in thought and vision of the Grecian girl a dreadful fury. Stings invisible and pitiless she planted in her breast, and drove her wandering throughout the globe. The utmost limit of her laboured way, O Nile, thou didst remain, which having reached and placed her tired knees on that river's edge, she laid there, and as she raised her neck upward to the stars, and groaned and wept and mournfully bellowed, trying thus to plead by all the means she had that Jupiter might end her miseries, repentant Jove embraced his consort and entreated her to end the punishment. "Fear not," he said, "for she shall trouble thee no more." He spoke, and called on bitter Styx to hear his oath. And now imperial Juno, pacified, permitted Io to resume her form. At once the hair fell from her snowy sides, the horns absorbed, her dilate orbs decreased, the opening of her jaws contracted, hands appeared and shoulders, and each transformed hoof became 5 nails. And every mark or form that gave the semblance of a heifer changed, except her fair white skin, and the glad nymph was raised erect and stood upon her feet. But long the very thought of speech, that she might bellow as a heifer, filled her mind with terror, till the words, so long forgot for some sufficient cause, were tried once more. And since that time the linen-wearing throng of Egypt have adored her as a god, for they believe the seed of Jove prevailed, and when her time was due she bore to him a son called Epiphus, who also dwells in temples with his mother in that land. Now Phaethon, whose father was the sun, was equal to his rival Epiphus in mind and years, and he was glad to boast of wonders, nor would yield to Epiphus for pride of Phoebus, his reputed sire. Unable to endure it, Io's son thus mocked him, "Poor, demented fellow, what will you not credit if your mother speaks? You are so puffed up with the fond conceit of your imagined sire, the lord of day." Shamed, crimsoned in his cheeks, but Phaethon, withholding rage, reported all the taunts of Epiphus to Clymene, his mother. "'Twill grieve you, mother. I, the bold and free, was silent, and it shames me to report that dark reproach remains unchallenged. Oh, if I am born of race divine, give me proof of that illustrious descent, and claim my right to heaven." Around his mother's neck he drew his arms, and by the head of Merops, and by his own, and by the nuptial torch of his beloved sisters, he implored for some true token of his origin. Or moved by Phaethon's importunate words, or by grievous charge, who might declare? She raised her arms to heaven, and gazing full upon the broad sun, said, "I swear to you by yonder orb, so radiant and bright, which both beholds and hears us while we speak, that you are his begotten son. You are the child of that great light which sways the world, And if I have not spoken what is true, let not mine eyes behold his countenance, and let this fatal moment be the last that I shall look upon the light of day. Nor will it weary you, my son, to reach your father's dwelling, for the very place where he appears at dawn is near our land. Go, if it please you, and the very truth learn from your father." Instantly sprang forth exultant Phaethon. Overjoyed with words so welcome, he imagined he could leap and touch the skies. And so he passed his land of Ethiopia and the Indies, hot beneath the tawny sun, and there he turned his footsteps to his father's land of dawn. End of Book 1, Part 3.
Book 2, Part 1 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Harrington. Metamorphoses by Publius Ovidius Naso. Translated by Brooks Moore. Book 2, Part 1. Glowing with gold, flaming with carbuncles on stately columns raised, refulgent shone the palace of the sun, with polished dome of ivory gleaming, and with portals twain of burnished silver. And the workmanship exceeded all the wealth of gems and gold, for there had Mulciber engraved the seas encircling middle earth, the round of earth, and heaven impending over the land. And there amid the waves were azure deities, melodious Triton and elusive Proteus, there Aegeon pressing with his arms the backs of monstrous whales, and Doris in the sea and all her daughters, some amid the waves, and others sitting on the bank to dry their sea-green hair, and others borne about by fishes. Each was made to show a fair resemblance to her sisters, yet not one appearance was assigned to all. They seemed as near alike as sisters should in truth. And men and cities, woods and savage beasts, and streams and nymphs, and sylvan deities were carved upon the land. And over these an image of the glittering sky was fixed. 6 signs were on the right, 6 on the left. Here, when audacious Phaethon arrived by steep ascending paths, without delay he entered in the shining palace gates of his reputed parent, making haste to stand in his paternal presence. There, unable to endure the dazzling light, he waited at a distance. Phoebus sat, arrayed in royal purple, on a throne that glittered with the purest emeralds. There to the left and right, day, month, and year, time and the hours, at equal distance stood, and vernal spring stood crowned with wreathed flowers, and naked summer stood with sheaves of wheat, and autumn stood besmeared with trodden grapes, and icy winter rough with hoary hair. And from the midst, with orbs that view the world, Phoebus beheld the trembling youth, fear-struck in mute amazement. And he said, "Declare the reason of thy journey. What wilt thou in this my palace, Phaethon, my child beloved?" And to him replied the youth, "O universal light of all the world, my father Phoebus, if thy name be mine, if Clymene has not concealed her sin beneath some pretext, give to me, my sire, a token to declare thy fatherhood, which may establish my assured descent, and leave no dark suspicions in our minds." Then Phoebus from his shining brows cast down his circling rays, called Phaethon to him, and as he held him to his breast, replied, "O child most worthy of my sire, the truth was told thee by thy mother. Wherefore doubts to dissipate, consider thy desire, and ask of me that I may freely give. Yea, let the nether lake beyond our view, which is the oath of gods inviolate, be witness to my word." When this was said, the happy youth at once began to plead command and guidance of his father's steeds, wing-footed, and his chariot for a day. But Phoebus much repented that he sware, and thrice and 4 times shook his radiant head. "Ah, would I might refuse my plighted word, and oh, that it were lawful to deny the promised boon. For I confess, O son, this only I should keep from thee, and yet 'tis lawful to dissuade." It is unsafe to satisfy thy will. It is a great request, O Phaethon, which neither suits thy utmost strength nor tender years. For thou art mortal, and thou hast aspired to things immortal. Ignorance has made thy thought transcend the province of the gods. I vaunt no vain exploits, but only I can stand securely on the flame-fraught axle tree. Even the ruler of Olympian gods, who hurls fierce lightnings with his great right hand, may never dare to drive this chariot. And what art thou to equal mighty Jove? The opening path is steep and difficult, for scarcely can the steeds, refreshed at dawn, climb up the steeps. And when it has reached the height extreme of midmost heaven, and sea and earth are viewed below, my trembling breast is filled with fearful apprehensions, and requires the last precipitous descent a sure command. Then also Tethys, who receives me in her subject waves, is wont to fear lest I should fall disastrous. And around the hasting sky revolves in constant whirl, drawing the lofty stars with rapid twist. I struggle on. The force that overcomes the heavenly bodies overwhelms me not, and I am borne against that rapid globe. Suppose the chariot thine, what canst thou do? Canst thou drive straight against the twisted pole, and not be carried from the lofty path by the swift car? Art thou deceived to think there may be groves and cities of the gods, and costly temples wondrously endowed? The journey is beset with dreadful snares and shapes of savage animals. If thou shouldst hold upon thy way without mistake, yet must thy journey be through Taurus' horns, and through the bow Haemonian, and the jaws of the fierce lion, and the cruel arms of Scorpion, bent throughout a vast expanse, and Cancer's curving arms reversely bent. It is no easy task for thee to rule the mettled 4-foot steeds, inflamed in fires that kindle in their breasts, forth issuing in breathings from their mouths and nostrils hot. I scarce restrain them, as their struggling necks pull on the harness, when their heated fires are thus aroused. And, O my son, lest I may be the author of a baneful gift, beware, and as the time permits, recall thy rash request. Forsooth thou hast besought undoubted signs of thy descent from me. My fears for thee are certain signs that thou art of my race. By my paternal fears 'tis manifest I am thy father. Lo, behold my countenance, and oh that thou couldst even pierce my bosom with thine eyes, and so discover my paternal cares. Look round thee on the treasured world's delights, and ask the greatest blessing of the sky or sea or land, and thou shalt suffer no repulse. But only this I must deplore, which rightly named would be a penalty and not an honor. Thou hast made request of punishment, and not a gift indeed. O witless boy, why dost thou hold my neck with thy caressing arms? For doubt it not, as I have sworn it by the Stygian waves, whatever thou shalt wish, it shall be given, but thou shouldst wish more wisely. So were all his admonitions said, availing naught, for Phaethon resisted his advice, and urged again his claim, and eagerly burned to use the chariot. Wherefore Phoebus, long delaying and reluctant, took the youth to view the spacious chariot, gift of Vulcan. Gold was the axle, and the beam was gold. The great wheel had a golden tire, and spokes of silver. Chrysolites and diamonds reflected from the spangled yoke the light of Phoebus. While aspiring Phaethon admired the glittering chariot and its workmanship, the vigilant Aurora opened forth her purple portals from the ruddy east, disclosing halls replete with roses. All the stars took flight, while Lucifer, the last to quit his vigil, gathered that great host and disappeared from his celestial watch. And when his father, Phoebus, Titan, saw the earth and the wide universe in glowing tints arrayed, as waned the moon's diminished horns, far distant, then he bade the nimble hours to yoke the steeds. At once the deities accomplished his commands, and led the steeds, ambrosia fed and snorting flames, from out their spacious stalls, and fixed their sounding bits. Then with a hallowed drug the father touched the stripling's face, to make him proof against the rapid flame, and wrought around his hair the sun rays. But foreboding grief, he said, while many a sigh heaved from his anxious breast, if thou canst only heed thy father's voice, be sparing of the whip, and use with nerve the reins, for of their own accord the steeds will hasten. Difficult are they to check in full career. Thou must not drive the car directly through 5 circles, for the track takes a wide curve obliquely and is bound by the extreme edge of 3 zones. It avoids the southern pole, and it avoids the bear that roams around the north. The way is plain, the traces of the wheel are manifest. Observe with care that both the earth and sky have their appropriate heat. Drive not too low, nor urge the chariot through the highest plain. For if thy course attain too great a height, thou wilt consume the mansions of the sky, and if too low, the land will scorch with heat. Take thou the middle plain, where all is safe. Nor let the wheel turn over to the right and bear thee to the twisted snake. Nor let it take thee to the altar on the left, so close to earth, but steer the middle course. To fortune I commit thy fate, whose care for thee, so reckless of thyself, I pray. While I am speaking, humid night has touched the margin of Hesperian shores. 'Tis not for us to idle. We are called away. When bright aurora shines, the darkness flies. Take up the reins. But if thy stubborn breast be capable of change, use not our car, but heed my counsel while the time permits, and while thy feet are on a solid base, but not, according to thy foolish wish, pressing the axle. Rather let me light the world beneath thy safe and wondering gaze. But Phaethon with youthful vigor leaped, and in the light-made chariot lightly stood. And he rejoiced, and with the reins in hand thanked his reluctant parent. Instantly Eos, Aethon, Pyrrhus, and Phlegon, the winged horses of the sun, gave vent to flame-like neighs that filled the shaking air. They pawed the barriers with their shining hoofs. Then Tethys, witless of her grandson's fate, let back the barriers, and the universe was theirs to traverse. Taking the well-known road and moving through the air with winged feet, they pierced resisting clouds, and spreading wide their pinions, soared upon the eastern wind, far wafted from that realm. But Phaethon, so easy of their yoke, lost all control, and the great car was tossed, as tapered ships, when lightened of their ballast, toss and heave unsteady in the surging seas. The car leaped lightly in the air, and in the heights was tossed unsteady as an empty shell. Soon as the steeds perceived it, with a rush impetuous, they left the beaten track, regardless of all order and control. And Phaethon, filled with fear, knew not to guide with trusted reins, nor where the way might be, nor, if he knew, could he control their flight. Warmed in the sunshine, never felt before, the gelid Triones attempted vain to bathe in the seas forbid. The serpent, cold and torpid by the frozen pole, too cold for contest, warmed, and rage assumed from the heat booties, troubled by the heat, took flight, impeded by his wane. And as from skies of utmost height unhappy Phaethon beheld the earth receding from his view, a pallor spread his cheeks with sudden fear. His knees began to quake, and through the flare of vast effulgence darkness closed his eyes. Now vainly he regrets he ever touched his father's steeds, and he is stunned with grief that so entreating he prevailed to know his true descent. He rather would be called the son of Merops, as a ship is tossed by raging Boreas, when the conquered helm has been abandoned, and the pilot leaves the vessel to his vows and to the gods, so helpless he is borne along the sky. What can he? Much of heaven remains behind. A longer distance is in front of him. Each way is measured in his anxious mind. At first his gaze is fixed upon the west, which fate has destined he shall never reach, and then his eyes turn backward to the east. So stupefied and dazed, he neither dares to loose the bits nor tighten on the reins, and he is ignorant of the horses' names. He sees horrific wonders scattered round, and images of hideous animals. And there's a spot where Scorpion bends his claws in double circles, and with tail and arms on either side stretches his limbs throughout the space of 2 celestial signs. And when the lad beheld him, steeped in oozing slime of venom, swart, and threatening to strike grim wounds with jagged spear points, he was lost, and fixed in chills of horror, dropped the reins. When these they felt upon their rising backs, the startled steeds sprang forthwith, and, unchecked, through atmospheres of regions unexplored, thence goaded by their unchecked violence, broke through the lawful bounds, and rushed upon the high-fixed stars. They dragged the chariot through devious ways, and soared amid the heights, dashed down deep pathways, far precipitous, and gained a level near the scorching earth. Phoebe is wondering that her brother's steeds run lower than her own, and sees the smoke of scorching clouds. The highest altitudes are caught in flames, and as their moistures dry, they crack in chasms. The grass is blighted, trees are burnt up with their leaves, the ripe brown crops give fuel for self-destruction. Oh, what small complaints! Great cities perish with their walls, and peopled nations are consumed to dust. The forests and the mountains are destroyed. Cilician Taurus, Athos, and Tmolus, and Uita are burning. And the far-famed Ida and all her cooling rills are dry and burning. And virgin Helicon, and Hoimos, later Oiagrius called, and Etna with tremendous redoubled flames, and double-peaked Parnassus, Sicilian Eryx, Cynthus, Othyrus, pine-clad, and Rhodope deprived his snowy mantle, and Dindima, and Mycale, and Mimas, and Mount Kithaeron, famed for sacred rites, and Scythia, though a land of frost, is burning, and Caucasus, and Ossa burns with Pindus, and greater than those two, Olympus burns, the lofty Alps, the cloud-topped Apennines. And Phaethon, as he inhaled the air, burning and scorching as a furnace blast, and saw destruction on the flaming world, and his great chariot wreathed in quenchless fires, was suddenly unable to endure the heat, the smoke, and the cinders, and he swooned away. If he had known the way, those winged steeds would rush as wild unguided. Then the skin of the Ethiopians took a swarthy hue, the hot blood tingling to the surface. Then the heat dried up the land of Libya. Disheveled, the lorn nymphs, lamenting, sought for all their emptied springs and lakes in vain. Boeotia wailed for Dirce's cooling wave, and Argos wailed for Amymne's stream, and even Corinth for the clear Pyrene. Not safer from the flames were distant streams. The Tanais in middle stream was steaming, and old Peneus, and Tuthrantian Caicus, Ismenus, rapid and Arcadian Erymanthus, and even Xanthus, destined for a second burning, and tawny waved Lycormus, and Meander, turning and twisting, and Thracian Melas burns, and the Laconian Eurotas burns, the mighty Babylonian Euphrates, Orontes, and the Ganges, swift Thermodon, Ister, and Phasis, and Alphaeus boil. The banks of Spercheius burn, the gold of Tagus is melting in the flames. The swans whose songs enhance the beauties of Maeonian banks are scalded in the Caister's middle wave. The Nile, affrighted, fled to parts remote, and hid his head forever from the world. Now empty are his 7 mouths, and dry without, or wave or stream. And also dry is Menian Hebrus, Strymon, and the streams of Hesperland, the rivers Rhine and Rhone and Po and Tiber, ruler of the world. And even as the ground asunder burst, the light amazed in gloomy Tartarus the king infernal and his spouse. The sea contracted, and his level waste became a sandy desert. The huge mountain tops, once covered by the ocean's waves, reared up, by which the scattered Cyclades increased. Even the fishes sought for deeper pools. The crooked dolphins dared not skip the waves. The lifeless sea calves floated on the top. And it is even famed that Nereus hid with Doris and her daughters deep below in seething caverns. With a dauntless mien, thrice Neptune tried to thrust his arms above the waters. Thrice the heated air overcame his courage. Then the genial earth, although surrounded by the waters of the sea, was parched and dry, for all her streams had hid deep in the darkness of her winding caves. She lifted her productive countenance up to her rounded neck, and held her palms on her sad brows. And as the mountains huge trembled and tottered, beneath her wonted plain declined she for a space, and thus began with parched voice, "If this is thy decree, O highest of the gods, if I have sinned, why do thy lightnings linger? For if doomed by fires consuming, I to perish must, let me now die in thy celestial flames, hurled by thine arm, and thus alleviate by thine omnipotence this agony." How difficult to open my parched mouth and speak these words, the vapors choking her. Behold my scorching hair, and see the clouds of ashes falling on my blinded eyes and on my features. What a recompense for my fertility! How often I have suffered from the wounds of crooked plows and rending harrows, tortured year by year. For this I give to cattle juicy leaves, and fruits to man, and frankincense to thee. Suppose destruction is my just award, what have the waters and thy brother done? Why should thy brother's cooling waves decrease, and thus recede so distant from the skies? If not thy brother's good, nor mine may touch thy mercy, let the pity of thy heaven, for lo, the smoking poles on either side attest, if flames consume them, or destroy the ruin of thy palace. Atlas, huge, with restive shoulders, hardly can support thy burning heavens. If the seas and lands together perish, and thy palace fall, the universe confused will plunge once more to ancient chaos. Save it from this wreck, if anything survive the fury of the flames. So made the tortured earth an end of speech, and she was fain to hide her countenance in caves that border on the nether night. But now the Almighty Father, having called to witness all the gods of heaven, and him who gave the car, that, else his power be shown, must perish all in dire confusion, high he mounted to the altitude from which he spreads the mantling clouds, and fulminates his dreadful thunders and swift lightning bolts terrific. Clouds were none to find on the earth, and the surrounding skies were void of rain. Jove, having reached that summit, stood and poised in his almighty hand a flashing dart, and, hurling it, deprived of life and seat the youthful charioteer, and struck with fire the raging flames. And by the same great force those flames enveloping the earth were quenched, and he who caused their fury lost his life. Frantic in their affright, the horses sprang across the bounded way and cast their yokes, and through the tangled harness lightly leaped. And here the scattered harness lay, and there the shattered axle, wrenched from off the pole, and various portions of the broken car. Spokes of the broken wheel were scattered round. And far fell Phaethon with flaming hair, as haply from the summer sky appears a falling star, although it never drops to startled earth. Far distant from his home, the deep Eridanus received the lad and bathed his foaming face. His body charred by triple flames, Hesperian naiads bore, still smoking, to a tomb, and this engraved upon the stone: "Here Phaethon's remains lie buried, he who drove his father's car and fell, although he made a great attempt." Filled with consuming woe, his father hid his countenance, which grief had overcast. And now, surpassing our belief, they say a day passed over with no glowing sun, but light affording flames appeared to change disaster to the cause of good. Amazed, the woeful Clymene, when she had moaned in grief, amid her lamentations tore her bosom, as across the world she roamed, at first to seek his lifeless corpse, and then his bones. She wandered to that distant land, and found at last his bones ensepulchred. There, clinging to the grave, she fell and bathed with many tears his name on marble carved, and with her bosom warmed the freezing stone. And all the daughters of the sun went there giving their tears, alas, a useless gift. They wept and beat their breasts, and day and night called Phaethon, who heard not any sound of their complaint. And there they lay fordone, all scattered round the tomb. The silent moon had 4 times joined her horns and filled her disk, while they, according to an ancient rite, made lamentation. Prone upon the ground, the eldest, Phaethusa, would arise from there, but found her feet were growing stiff, and uttered moan. Lampetia wished to aid her sister, but was hindered by new roots. A third, when she would tear her hair, plucked forth but leaves. Another wailed to find her legs were fastened in a tree. Another moaned to find her arms to branches had been changed. And while they wondered, bark enclosed their thighs and covered their smooth bellies, and their breasts and shoulders and their hands, but left untouched their lips that called upon their mother's name. What can she do for them? Hither she runs and thither runs, wherever frenzy leads. She kisses them, alas, while yet she may. But not content with this, she tried to hale their bodies from the trees. And she would tear the tender branches with her hands, but lo, the blood oozed out as from a bleeding wound. And as she wounded them, they shrieked aloud, "Spare me, O mother, spare me! In the tree my flesh is torn. Farewell, farewell, farewell!" And as they spoke, the bark enclosed their lips. Their tears flow forth, and from the new-formed boughs amber distills, and slowly hardens in the sun. And far from there upon the waves is born to deck the Latin women. Cycnus, son of Sthenelus, by his maternal house akin to Phaethon, and thrice by love allied, beheld this wonderful event. He left his kingdom of Liguria, and all its peopled cities, to lament where the sad sisters had increased the woods, beside the green banks of Eridanus. There, as he made complaint, his manly voice began to pipe a treble shrill, and long grey plumes concealed his hair. A slender neck extended from his breast, and reddening toes were joined together by a membrane. Wings grew from his sides, and from his mouth was made a blunted beak. Now Cycnus is a swan, and yet he fears to trust the skies and Jove, for he remembers fires unjustly sent, and therefore shuns the heat that he abhors, and haunts the spacious lakes and pools and streams that quench the fires. In squalid garb, meanwhile, and destitute of all his rays, the sire of Phaethon, as dark as when eclipse bedims his wheel, abhors himself and hates the light, shuns the bright day, gives up his mind to grief, adds passion to his woe, denies the earth his countenance, and thus laments, "My lot was ever restless from the dawn of time, and I am weary of this labor void and endless. Therefore, let who will urge forth my car light-bearing, and if none may dare, when all the gods of heaven acknowledge it, let Jove himself essay the task. Perchance, when he takes up the reins, he may forget his dreadful lightning that bereaves of child a father's love, and as he tries the strength of those flame-footed steeds will know, in truth, the lad who failed to guide my chariot deserved not death." But all the deities encircle Phoebus as he makes complaint, and with their supplications they entreat him not to plunge the world in darkness. Jove would find excuses for the lightning bolt hurled from his hand and adds imperious threats to his entreaties. Phoebus calls his steeds, frenzied with their maddening fires, and breaks their fury as he vents with stinging lash his rage upon them, and in passion lays on them the death of Phaethon, his son. End of Book 2, Part 1.
Book 2, Part 2 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Metamorphoses by Publius Ovidius Naso. Translated by Brooks Moore. Book 2, Part 2. Now, after Phaeton had suffered death for the vast ruin wrought by scorching flames, all the great walls of heaven's circumference, unmeasured, views the Father of the gods with searching care, that none impaired by heat may fall in ruins. Well assured they stand in self-sustaining strength, his view, at last, on all the mundane works of man is turned, his loving gaze long resting on his own Arcadia. And he starts the streams and springs that long have feared to flow, paints the wide earth with verdant fields, covers the trees with leaves, and clothes the injured forests in their green. While wandering in the world, he stopped amazed when he beheld the lovely nymph Callisto, and fires of love were kindled in his breast. Callisto was not clothed in sumptuous robes, nor did she deck her hair in artful coils, but with a buckle she would gird her robe and bind her long hair with a fillet white. She bore a slender javelin in her hand, or held the curving bow, and thus in arms as chaste Diana, none of Menelaus was loved by that fair goddess more than she. But everything must change. When bright the sun rolled down the sky, beyond his middle course, she pierced a secret thicket known to her, and having slipped the quiver from her arm, she loosed the bended bow, and softly down upon the velvet turf reclining, pressed her white neck on the quiver while she slept. When Jupiter beheld her, negligent and beautiful, he argued thus: How can my consort Juno learn of this? And yet if chance should give her knowledge, what care I? Let gain offset the scolding of her tongue. This said, the god transformed himself, and took Diana's form, assumed Diana's dress, and imitating her, awoke the maid, and spoke in gentle tones. What mountain slope, O virgin of my train, hath been thy chase? Which, having heard, Callisto rose and said, Hail, goddess! Greater than celestial Jove, I would declare it though he heard the words. Jove heard and smiled, well pleased to be preferred above himself, and kissed her many times, and strained her in his arms, while she began to tell the varied fortunes of her hunt. But when his ardent love was known to her, she struggled to escape from his embrace. Ah, how could she, a tender maid, resist almighty Jove? Be sure, Saturnia, if thou hadst only witnessed her, thy heart had shown more pity. Jupiter, on wings transcendent, sought his glorious heights, but she, in haste departing from that grove, almost forgot her quiver and her bow. Behold, Diana, with her virgin train, when hunting on the slopes of Menelaus, amidst the pleasures of exciting sport, espied the nymph and called her, who, afraid that Jove, apparelled in disguise, deceived, drew backward for a moment, till appeared to her the lovely nymphs that followed. Thus assured deceit was none, she ventured near. Alas, how difficult to hide disgrace! She could not raise her vision from the ground, nor as the leader of the hunting nymphs, as was her wont, walk by the goddess's side. Her silence and her blushes were the signs of injured honor. Ah, Diana, thou, if thou wert not a virgin, wouldst perceive and pity her unfortunate distress. The moon's bent horns were rising from their ninth sojourn, when, fainting from Apollo's flames, the goddess of the chase observed a cool, umbrageous grove, from which a murmuring stream ran babbling gently over its golden sands. When she approved the spot, lightly she struck her foot against the ripples of the stream, and praising it, began, "Far from the gaze of all the curious, we may bathe our limbs and sport in this clear water." Quickly they undid their garments, but Callisto hid behind the others till they knew her state. Diana in a rage exclaimed, "Away! Thou must not desecrate our sacred springs," and she was driven thence. Ere this transpired, observed the consort of the thunder god her altered mien, but she for ripening time withheld severe resentment. Now delay was needless, for distracted Juno heard Callisto of the god of heaven had borne a boy called Arcas. Full of jealous rage, her eyes and thoughts enkindled as she cried, "And only this was wanting to complete your wickedness, that you should bear a son and flaunt abroad the infamy of Jove. Unpunished you shall not escape, for I will spoil the beauty that has made you proud and dazzle Jupiter with wanton art." So saying, by her forehead's tresses seized the goddess on her rival, and she dragged her roughly to the ground. Pleading, she raised her suppliant arms and begged for mercy. While she pled, black hair spread over her white limbs, her hands were lengthened into feet, and claws long curving tipped them. Snarling jaws deformed the mouth that Jove had kissed, and lest her prayers and piteous words might move some listening god and give remembrance, speech was so denied that only from her throat came angry growls, now uttered hoarse and threatening. Still remains her understanding, though her body, thus transformed, makes her appear a savage bear. Her sorrows are expressed in many a groan, repeated as she lifts her hands, if we may call them so, repeated as she lifts them towards the stars and skies, ungrateful Jove regarding, but her voice accuses not. Afraid to rest in unfrequented woods, she wandered in the fields that once were hers, around her well-known dwelling. Over crags, in terror, she was driven by the cries of hounds, and many a time she fled in fear, a huntress from the hunters. Or she hid from savage animals, forgetting her transformed condition. Changed into a bear, she fled affrighted from the bears that haunt the rugged mountains, and she feared and fled the wolves, although her father was a wolf. When thrice 5 birthdays rounded out the youth of Arcas, offspring of Lycaon's child, he hunted in the forest of his choice, where, hanging with his plaited nets the trees of Erymanthian forest, he espied his transformed mother, but he knew her not. No one had told him of his parentage. Knowing her child, she stood with leveled gaze, amazed and mute as he began approach. But Arcas, frightened at the sight, drew back to pierce his mother's breast with wounding spear, but not permitting it, the god of heaven averted and removed them from that crime. He, in a mighty wind, through vacant space, upbore them to the dome of starry heaven, and fixed them, constellations, bright amid the starry host. Juno on high beheld Callisto crowned with glory. Great with rage her bosom heaved. She flew across the sea, to hoary Tethys, and to old Oceanus, whom all the gods revere, and thus to them in answer to their words she made address. And is it wondered that the queen of gods comes hither from ethereal abodes? My rival sits upon the throne of heaven. Yea, when the wing of night has darkened, let my fair word be deemed of no repute. if you behold not in the height of heaven those new-made stars, now honored to my shame, conspicuous, fixed in the highest dome of space that circles the utmost axis of the world. Who, then, should hesitate to put affront on Juno, matchless goddess? Each offense redounds in benefit. Who dreads her rage? O boundless powers, O unimagined deeds! My enemy assumes a goddess's form when my decree deprives her human shape, and thus the guilty rue their chastisement. Now let high Jove to human shape transform this hideous beast, as once before he changed his low from a heifer. Let him now divorce his Juno and consort with her, and lead Callisto to his couch, and take that wolf Lycian for a father-in-law. Oh, if an injury to me, your child, may move your pity, drive the 7 stars from waters crystalline and azure tent, and your domain debar from those that shine in heaven, rewarded for Jove's wickedness. Bathe not a concubine in waters pure. The gods of ocean granted her request. High in her graceful chariot through the air, translucent, wends the goddess, glorious child of Saturn, with her peacocks many-hued, her peacocks by the death of Argus limped, so gay were made when black as midnight turned thy wings, O chattering raven, white of yore. For long ago the ravens were not black, their plumage then was white as any dove, white-feathered, snow-white as the geese that guard with watchful cries the Capitol, as white as swans that haunt the streams. Disgrace reversed the raven's hue from white to black, because offense was given by his chattering tongue. O glorious Phoebus, dutiful to thee, Coronis of Larissa, fairest maid of all Aemonia, was a grateful charm, a joy to thee whilst faithful to thy love, while none defamed her chastity. But when the raven, bird of Phoebus, learned the nymph had been unfaithful, mischief bent that bird, spreading his white wings, hastened to impart the sad news to his master. After him the prattling crow followed, with flapping wings, eager to learn what caused the raven's haste. Concealing nothing with his busy tongue, the raven gave the scandal to that bird, and unto him the prattling crow replied, A fruitless errand has befooled thy wits. Take timely warning of my fateful cries. Consider what I was, and what I am. Was justice done? 'Twas my fidelity that caused my downfall, for it came to pass, within a basket, fashioned of small twigs, Minerva had enclosed that spawn, begot without a mother, Erichthonius, which to the wardship of 3 virgins, born of double-natured Cecrops, she consigned with this injunction, Look ye not therein, nor learn the secret. But I saw their deeds, while hidden in the leaves of a great tree, 2 of the sisters, Herse and Pandrosos, observed the charge, but scoffing at their fears. The third, Aglaros, with her nimble hands, untied the knotted cords, and there disclosed a serpent and an infant. This I told Minerva, but in turn she took away her long protection, and degraded me beneath the boding owl. My punishment should warn the birds how many dangers they incur from chattering tongues. Not my desire impelled me to report to her, nor did I crave protection, which, if thou wilt ask Minerva, though enraged she must confirmed, and when is told to thee what lately fame established, thou wilt not despise the crow, begot by Coronius, who was lord of all the land of Phocis. I was once a royal virgin, sought by suitors rich and powerful, but beauty proved the cause of my misfortune, for it came to pass, as I was slowly walking on the sands that skirt the merge of ocean, where was oft my wont to roam, the god of ocean gazed impassioned, and with honeyed words implored my love. But finding that I paid no heed, and all his words despised, he fumed with rage and followed me. I fled from that seashore to fields of shifting sands that all my steps delayed, and in despair upon the gods and all mankind I called for aid, but I was quite alone and helpless. Presently the chaste Minerva, me a virgin, heard, and me assistance gave. For as my arms implored the heavens, downy feathers grew from out the flesh, and as I tried to cast my mantle from my shoulders, wings appeared upon my tender sides. And as I strove to beat my naked bosom with my hands, nor hands remained nor naked breast to beat. I ran, and as I sped, the sands no more delayed me. I was soaring from the ground, and as I winged the air, Minerva chose me for a life companion. But alas, although my life was blameless, fate or chance deprived me of Minerva's loving aid, for soon Nyctemene succeeded me to her protection and deserved esteem. It happened in this way. Nyctemene committed the most wicked crimes, for which Minerva changed her to the bird of night, and ever since has claimed her as her own instead of me, and this despite the deed for which she shuns the glorious light of day, and conscious of her crime conceals her shame in the dark night. Minerva's owl now called. All the glad birds of day indignant shun, and chase her from the skies. But now replied the raven to the crow that talks so much, a mischief fall upon your prating head for this detention of my flight. Your words and warnings I despise. With which retort he winged upon his journey, swiftly thence in haste, despite the warnings to inform his patron, Phoebus, how he saw the fair Coronis with a lad of Thessaly. And when Apollo, Phoebus, heard the tale the busy raven made such haste to tell, he dropped his plectrum and his laurel wreath, and his bright countenance went white with rage. He seized his trusted arms, and having bent his certain bow, pierced with a deadly shaft that bosom which so often he had pressed against his own. Coronis moaned in pain, and as she drew the keen shaft from the wound, her snow-white limbs were bathed in purple blood, and thus she wailed, "Ah, Phoebus, punishment is justly mine, but wherefore didst thou not await the hour of birth? For by my death an innocent is slain." This said, her soul expired with her life-blood, and death congealed her drooping form. Sadly the love-lore god repents his jealous deed, regrets too late his ready credence to the raven's tale. Mourning his thoughtless deed, blaming himself, he vents his rage upon the talking bird. He hates his bow, the string, his own right hand, the fateful arrow. As a last resource, and thus to overcome her destiny, he strove to cherish her beloved form, for vain were all his medicinal arts. But when he saw upraised the funeral pyre, where, wreathed in flames, her body should be burnt, the sorrow of his heart welled forth in sighs, but tearless Ovid, for no celestial face may tide of woe bedew. So grieves the poor dam, when, swinging from his right the flashing axe, the butcher with a sounding blow divides the hollow temples of her sucking calf. Yet after Phoebus poured the fragrant myrrh, sweet perfumes on her breast, that now once more against his own he pressed, and after all the prematurely hastened rites were done, he would not suffer the offspring of his loins to mingle with her ashes, but he plucked from out the flames, forth from the mother's thighs, his child unborn, and carried to the cave of double-natured Chiron. Then to him he called the silly raven, high in hopes of large requital, due for all his words. But, angry with his meddling ways, the god turned the white feathers of that bird to black, and then forbade for evermore to perch among the favored birds whose plumes are white. End of Book 2, Part 2.
Book 2, Part 3 of Ovid's Metamorphoses. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Raven Notation. Metamorphoses by Publius Ovidius Naso. translated by Brooks Moore. Book 2, Part 3. Chiron, the centaur, taught his pupil, proud that he was honoured by that godlike charge. Behold his lovely daughter, who was born beside the margin of a rapid stream, came forward, with her yellow hair as gold adorn her shoulders. She was known by name Ocairo. The hidden things that fate conceals, she had the power to tell, for not content was she to learn her father's arts, but rather pondered on mysterious things. So when the god of frenzy warmed her breast, gazing on Aesculapius, the child of Phoebus and Coronis, while her soul was gifted with prophetic voice, she said, O thou, who wilt bestow on all the world the blessed boon of health, increase in strength, to thee shall mortals often owe their lives. To thee is given the power to raise the dead. But when against the power of deities thou shalt presume to dare thy mortal skill, the bolts of Jove will shatter thy great might, and health no more be thine from thence to grant. And from a god thou shalt return to dust, and once again from dust become a god, and thou shalt thus renew thy destiny. And thou, dear Father Chiron, brought to birth with pledge of an immortal life, informed with ever-during strength, when biting flames of torment from the baneful serpent's blood are coursing in thy veins, thou shalt implore a welcome death, and thy immortal life the gods shall suffer to the power of death, and the 3 destinies shall cut thy thread. She would continue these prophetic words, but tears unbidden trickled down her face, and, as it seemed her sighs would break her heart, she thus bewailed, The fates constrain my speech, and I can say no more. My power has gone. Alas, my art, although of little force and doubtful worth, has brought upon my head the wrath of heaven. O wherefore did I know to cast the future? Now my human form puts on another shape, and the long grass affords me needed nourishment. I want to range the boundless plains, and have become, in image of my father's kind, a mare. But gaining this, why lose my human shape? My father's form is one of 2 combined. And as she wailed, the words became confused and scarcely understood, and soon her speech was only as the whining of a mare. Down to the meadows green her arms were stretched, her fingers joined together, and smooth hoofs made of 5 nails a single piece of horn. Her face and neck were lengthened, and her hair swept downward as a tail. The scattered locks that clung around her neck were made a mane, tossed over to the right. Her voice and shape were altogether changed, and since that day the change has given her a different name. In vain her hero father, Chiron, prayed the glorious god Apollo her to aid. He could not thwart the will of mighty Jove, and if the power were his, far from the spot, from thence afar his footsteps trod the fields of Elis and Messenia, far from thence. Now, while Apollo wandered on those plains, his shoulders covered with a shepherd's skin, his left hand holding his long shepherd's staff, his right hand busied with the 7 reeds of 7 sizes, brooding over the death of Hymenaeus, lost from his delight, while mournful ditties on the reeds were tuned, his kine, forgotten, strayed away to graze over the plains of Pylos. Mercury observed them, unattended, and from thence drove them away and hid them in the forest. So deftly did he steal them, no one knew or noticed save an ancient forester, well known to all the neighbour folk, by them called Battus. He was keeper of that wood, and that green pasture where the blooded mares of rich Neleus grazed. As Mercury distrusted him, He led him to one side and said, Good stranger, whosoever thou art, if any one should haply question thee, if thou hast seen these kine, deny it all, and for thy good will, ere the deed is done, I give as thy reward this handsome cow. Now when the gift was his, old Battus said, Go hence in safety, if it be thy will, and should my tongue betray thee, let that stone make mention of the theft. And as he spoke, he pointed to a stone. The son of Jove pretended to depart, but quickly changed his voice and features, and retraced his steps, and thus again addressed that ancient man. Kind sir, if thou wouldst earn a fair reward, a heifer and a bull, if thou hast seen some cattle pass, I pray thee give thy help, and tell me of the theft. So the reward was doubled, and the old man answered him, Beyond those hills they be, and so they were beyond those hills. And laughing, Mercury said, Thou treacherous man, to me dost thou betray myself? Dost thou bewray me to myself? The god, indignant, turned his perjured breast into a stone, which even now is called the Spy of Pylos, a disgraceful name, derived from days of old, but undeserved. High in the dome of heaven, behold the bright caduceus bearer, soared on balanced wings, and far below him through a fruitful grove, devoted to Minerva's hallowed reign, some virgins bearing on their lovely heads, in wicker baskets wreathed and decked with flowers, their sacred offerings to the citadel of that chaste goddess. And the winged god, while circling in the clear unbounded skies, beheld that train of virgins, beautiful, as they were thence returning on their way. Not forward on a level line he flew, but wheeled in circles round. Lo, the swift kite swoops round the smoking entrails, while the priests enclose in guarded ranks their sacrifice. Wary with fear, that swiftest of all birds dares not to venture from his vantage height, but greedily hovers on his waving wings around his keen desire. So the bright god circled those towers, Actaeon, round and round, in mazy circles, greedy as the bird. As much as Lucifer outshines the stars that emulate the glory of his rays, as greatly as bright Phoebe pales thy light, O lustrous Lucifer, so far surpassed in beauty the fair maiden hearse, all those lovely virgins of that sacred train, departing joyous from Minerva's grove. The son of Jove, astonished, while he wheeled on balanced pinions through the yielding air, burned hot, as oft from Balearic sling the leaden missile, hurled with sudden force, burns in a glowing heat beneath the clouds. Then sloped the god his course from airy height, and turned a different way. Another way he went without disguise, in confidence of his celestial grace. But though he knew his face was beautiful, he combed his hair, and fixed his flowing raiment, that the fringe of radiant gold appeared, and in his hand he waved his long smooth wand, with which he gives the wakeful sleep, or waketh ridden eyes. He proudly glanced upon his twinkling feet, that sparkled with their scintillating wings. In a secluded part of that great fane, devoted to Minerva's hallowed rites, 3 chambers were adorned with tortoise shell, and ivory, and precious woods inlaid, and there, devoted to Minerva's praise, 3 well-known sisters dwelt. Upon the right dwelt Pandrosus, and over on the left Aglurus dwelt, and Herse occupied the room between those 2. When Mercury drew near to them, Aglurus first espied the god, and ventured to inquire his name, and wherefore he was come. Then Gracious spoke to her in answer the bright son of Jove. Behold the god who carries through the air the mandates of almighty Jupiter! But I come hither not to waste my time in idle words, but rather to beseech thy kindness and good aid, that I may win the love of thy devoted sister Herse. Aglaurus, on the son of Jupiter, gazed with those eyes that only lately viewed the guarded secret of the yellow-haired Minerva, and demanded as her price gold of great weight, before he paid denied admittance of the house. Minerva turned, with orbs of stern displeasure, towards the maid Aglaurus, and her bosom heaved with sighs so deeply laboured that her aegis shield was shaken on her valiant breast. For she remembered when Aglaurus gave to view her charge with impious hand that monster form without a mother, maugre nature's law, what time the god who dwells on Lemnos loved. Now to requite the god and sister, her to punish whose demand of gold was great, Minerva to the cave of envy sped. Dark, hideous with black gore, her dread abode is hidden in the deepest hollowed cave, in utmost limits where the genial sun may never shine, and where the breathing winds may never venture. Dismal, bitter cold, untempered by the warmth of welcome fires, involved forever in abounding gloom. When the fair champion came to this abode, she stood before its entrance, for she deemed it not a lawful thing to enter there, and she whose arm is mortal to her foes struck the black door-posts with her pointed spear, and shook them to the centre. Straight the doors flew open, and behold, within was envy, ravening the flesh of vipers, self-begot, the nutriment of her depraved desires. When the great goddess met her evil gaze, she turned her eyes away. But envy, slow, in sluggish languor, from the ground uprose, and left the scattered serpents half devoured, then moving with a sullen pace approached. And when she saw the gracious goddess, girt with beauty and resplendent in her arms, she groaned aloud and fetched up heavy sighs. Her face is pale, her body long and lean, her shifting eyes glance to the left and right, her snaggle teeth are covered with black rust, her hanging paps overflow with bitter gall, her slavered tongue drips venom to the ground. Busy in schemes and watchful in dark snares, sweet sleep is banished from her bloodshot eyes. Her smiles are only seen when others weep. With sorrow she observes the fortunate, and pines away as she beholds their joy. Her own existence is her punishment, and while tormenting she torments herself. Although Minerva held her in deep scorn, she thus commanded her with winged words. Instil thy poison in Aglaurus, child of Cecrops. I command thee, do my will. She spake, and spurning with her spear the ground departed. And the sad and furtive-eyed envy observed her in her glorious flight. She murmured at the goddess, great in arms, but waiting not, she took in hand her staff, which bands of thorns encircled as a wreath, and veiled in midnight clouds departed thence. She blasted on her way the ripening fields, scorched the green meadows, starred with flowers, and breathed a pestilence throughout the land and the great cities. When her eyes beheld the glorious citadel of Athens, great in art and wealth, abode of joyful peace, she hardly could refrain from shedding tears, that nothing might be witnessed worthy tears. She sought the chamber where Aglaurus slept, and hastened to obey the god's behest. She touched the maiden's bosom with her hands, foul with corrupting stains, and pierced her heart with jagged thorns, and breathed upon her face a noxious venom, and distilled through all the marrow of her bones, and in her lungs, a poison blacker than the ooze of pitch. And lest the canker of her poisoned soul might spread unchecked throughout increasing space, she caused a vision of her sister's form to rise before her, happy with the god who shone in his celestial beauty. All appeared more beautiful than real life. When the most wretched daughter of Cecrops had seen the vision, secret torment seized on all her vitals, and she groaned aloud, tormented by her frenzy day and night. A slow consumption wasted her away, as ice is melted by the slant sunbeam, when the cool clouds are flitting in the sky. If she but thought of Herse's happiness, she burned, as thorny bushes are consumed with smouldering embers under steaming stems. She could not bear to see her sister's joy, and longed for death, an end of misery, or schemed to end the torture of her mind by telling all she knew in shameful words, whispered to her austere and upright sire. But after many agonizing hours, she sat before the threshold of their home to intercept the god, who, as he neared, spoke softly in smooth blandishment. "Enough," she said. "I will not move from here until thou hast departed from my sight." "Let us adhere to that which was agreed," rejoined the graceful form Cyllenian god, who as he spoke thrust open with a touch of his compelling wand the carved door. But when she made an effort to arise, her thighs felt heavy, rigid, and benumbed, and as she struggled to arise, her knees were stiffened, and her nails turned pale and cold. Her veins grew pallid as the blood congealed, and even as the dreaded cancer spreads through all the body, adding to its taint the flesh uninjured, so a deadly chill entered by slow degrees her breast, and stopped her breathing and the passages of life. She did not try to speak, but had she made an effort to complain, there was not left a passage for her voice. Her neck was changed to rigid stone, her countenance felt hard. She sat a bloodless statue, but of stone not marble white. Her mind had stained it black. So from the land of Pallas went the god, his great revenge accomplished on the head of impious Aglaurus, and he soared on waving wings into the open skies, and there his father called him to his side, and said, with words to hide his passion, "Son, thou faithful minister of my commands, let naught delay thee. Swiftly take the way, accustomed to the land of Sidon, which adores thy mother's star upon the left. When there, drive over to the sounding shore that royal herd which far away is fed on mountain grass." He spoke, and instantly the herd was driven from the mountain side, then headed for the shore, as Jove desired, to where the great king's daughter often went in play, attended by the maids of Tyre. Can love abide the majesty of kings? Love cannot always dwell upon a throne. Jove laid aside his glorious dignity, for he assumed the semblance of a bull, and mingled with the bullocks in the groves, his colour white as virgin snow, untrod, unmelted by the watery southern wind. His neck was thick with muscles, dewlaps hung between his shoulders, and his polished horns, so small and beautifully set, appeared the artifice of man, fashioned as fair and more transparent than a lucent gem. His forehead was not lowered for attack, nor was there fury in his open eyes. The love of peace was in his countenance. When she beheld his beauty and mild eyes, The daughter of Ujnor was amazed, but, daring not to touch him, stood apart until her virgin fears were quieted. Then, near him, fragrant flowers in her hand she offered, tempting to his gentle mouth. And then the loving god in his great joy kissed her sweet hands and could not wait her will. Jove then began to frisk upon the grass, or laid his snow-white side on the smooth sand, yellow and golden. As her courage grew, he gave his breast one moment for caress, or bent his head for garlands newly made, wreathed for his polished horns. The royal maid, unwitting what she did, at length sat down upon the bull's broad back. Then by degrees the god moved from the land and from the shore, and placed his feet, that seemed but shining hooves, in shallow water by the sandy merge, and not a moment resting before her thence, across the surface of the middle sea, while she affrighted gazed upon the shore, so fast receding. And she held his horn with her right hand, and, steadied by the left, held on his ample back, and in the breeze her waving garments fluttered as they went. End of Book 2, Part 3.